Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to Albums I Hated But Grew to Love. Part 1. There will be a part 2 of this that'll post tomorrow, so do check back for that. But with all the great albums that our favorite bands put out, unfortunately, there are sometimes missteps, a few clunkers, some duds, things like that, that upon first listen, at least for me, I couldn't get into. I just simply did not enjoy. And unfortunately, sometimes those albums remain my least favorite. Other times I end up warming up to those albums and wonder why it is that I ever hated them in the first place. So join me as I run through 10 such albums here in episode part 1. Remember, there will be a part 2 episode posting tomorrow that you can check back for, and we'll complete the run through there. But before we get started here, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by turning on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on really cool episodes like this with albums I hated but grew to love. So for part 1 here, we're going to run through the letters A through M, and then as part of part 2, tomorrow we'll pick up with M and we'll run through the letter Z. So kicking things off, we're starting with Aerosmith, Just Push Play from 2001, 13th studio album. This one here, when it came out, was just far too contemporary for me. You know, the adding of the drum loops, the beats, things like that. But what's kind of crazy here is that while I really couldn't get into it at the time, I mean, I liked the first single that came off of it, Jaded. I thought that was fantastic. But I just really didn't find anything else in there that stuck with me, that lived with me. And so I've been making some of these videos about worst albums by the biggest bands and things like that. Well, this one here kept making that list. And because I kept pulling it out, I decided to throw it on. And you know what? I've actually found out, now listening to it again a bunch of times, that I'm really enjoying this album. So this one here is actually one of the newest ones that is making my sort of turnaround on here, turning out to be one that in time I've now found that I really enjoy this album. So, and that's what we're going to find going through a lot of these here. Next one up, Bon Jovi, Keeping the Faith, or Keep the Faith, 1992, 5th studio album, produced by Bob Rock. You know, after the 2 monumental glam metal albums that they did, Slippery When Wet in 1986 in New Jersey and 1988, and then unfortunately waiting 4 years, changing producers from Bruce Fairbairn to Bob Rock, it just, you know, moving to a more traditional rock sound, like all of those sort of things just became a shock for me when I heard this at the time. I was not yet ready for that sort of shift, and Bon Jovi was one of the first big bands to do that sort of a thing. And while it's not that far removed from Slippery When Wet and New Jersey, at the time I just remember thinking that I was not into it at all. And mostly the lead single that came off of it, the title track, Keep the Faith, was just also a subject matter, a style, just everything about it was so not my Bon Jovi kind of a thing. But a few years later, I would get into this much more around 1995 and find that I actually did very much enjoy it, despite it's a bit more mellower sort of listening state that it's in. But that's what a lot of these are. I think just given the time, a lot of these things can grow on you as they did me. Next one up, The Cult, self-titled release from 1994, 6th studio album. So for this one here, like a lot of the bands that were doing at the time, they veered into grunge, even some industrial, alternative rock, and they had moved away from the sort of stadium rock sound that they had done on their last 3 albums. So again, this was one of those things where I'm listening to those albums, I'm expecting stuff like Sonic Temple and Electric, things like that. And then I got this, and it was just a real shock. Now, in retrospect, looking back and seeing all the different styles of albums that the band has done over the years, including the ones through the early 2000s and stuff like that, this really isn't that far out of their typical wheelhouse, so to speak. But at the time, it really seemed like a big jump for me, and it just wasn't something I was into. But in time, again, it was one of those things that I really warmed up to, liking that difference. And I actually would say it's albums like this one and some of these other ones here that we're going to talk about today that sort of opened me up to being more open to bands experimenting and changing and doing things and not being so stuck on the fact that a band has to maintain its original sound. All right, case in point with the next one here. Def Leppard, Slang from 1996, sixth studio album. This one here was a much darker, heavier, slower, dirgier, muddier sounding album than anything that had come before it, in my opinion. And with that super high level of production that had been on Pyromania, Hysteria, and even Adrenalize, even though that was not done by Mutt Lange, it still had that level of production. And this here was missing it for the most part. It's in there on certain tracks, like Work It Out, which was a song I really liked until I got the album, and then nothing else on the album sounded like that. And I really think it had to do with the first two songs that opened up this album here that had that darker, more grungy style sound that was just not anything that I would ever have wanted Def Leppard to do. And it's one of those albums, though, that again, in retrospect, coming back to it, there's actually quite a bit to love on. The album itself, one of my favorite songs on here, Deliver Me, is one of my all-time favorite Def Leppard songs. So, it just goes to show that in time, your taste can change. And I think that's part of it too, where at the time in the mid 90s when this came out, my mind was still set on a particular style of rock and so forth. And over the next, 20 years or whatever, my tastes have changed. And so coming back to these albums now and giving them fresh listens, and this isn't all like right now, I'm sort of saying some of these are albums that I grew to love in time over the last decade or so, kind of a thing like that. So this being one of them. All right, next one up, Dio, Strange Highway from 1994, sixth studio album. First one to feature at the time new guitarist Tracy G, who'd record a couple albums with him. But this one here seemed to be more reflective of the darker, slower Black Sabbath style. Not necessarily a bad thing, except that they merged a grunge sort of style sound into it. And at the time, at least, I just felt it was sort of contrived in a lesser version of Black Sabbath's album Dehumanizer that Dio had just completed with the band in 1992, which I really loved. But this one here just, in my opinion, did not measure up to that. So while it didn't sound like Dio, it also didn't sound like Dehumanizer, at least not to the level that I would have liked it at. So I sort of dismissed it, and it's one of those ones that I since have gone back to. And when I'm in the mood for that sort of slower paced Black Sabbath, heavier style sound, this album here is really good. And now I actually listen to Dehumanizer and Strange Highway, usually back to back. If I'm going to pull one out, I'm going to listen to the other one. So it ended up pulling me around to it eventually. It just took a while. All right, next one up, Extreme, Waiting for the Punchline, 1995, fourth studio album. Last one before Gary Cherone would lead to go front Van Halen. This one here was definitely an attempt for the band to modernize themselves. They reduced the amount of lead guitar work on here. They created a much more stripped down production and unfortunately removed what I consider to be, trademark, sort of hallmark styles and signatures and sound of what the band was from their first three albums to where it was almost unrecognizable on this. Certainly the vocals on here still screamed Extreme. Gary Cherone was still very much up front and everything, but Nuno Bettencourt's guitar had really kind of been muddied and pushed to the back on here. But I mean, that was an all intentional thing that they were doing, and they have stuck with that sound ever since. So I don't think they're ever going to go back to making an album like the first three. But we did get this, and it took me a long time, somewhere into the 2000s, before I finally kind of warmed up to this and accepted it as what it is. It's not going to sound like Pornograffiti. It's not going to sound like the debut or Three Sides. But it's still a great album for what it is. And there's a lot of cool little hidden guitar parts, playing around underneath things in there if you give a listen to it. It's still going on. It's still very complicated stylistically and that sort of stuff, but it's just not in your face the way the other albums were. All right, the next one, INXS Full Moon Dirty Hearts from 1993, their 9th studio album. This one here was a big musical shift, in my opinion at least, from the previous album, Welcome to Wherever You Are, from 1992. And since they didn't tour for that album and they went right back in the studio to make this one here, you would have thought they would have been like companion pieces, but they're very different. This one here was kind of came across as not as accessible. I felt that Welcome to Wherever You Are was much more immediately accessible than this album. And this one here took a long time again for me to warm up to it, with the tracks being a bit more abrasive on it. Case in point, like the songs The Gift or Time. And then the weird pairing that they did with Ray Charles on the song Please You Got That. That just did not speak to me at the time. I still actually don't care for that song, Please. But I have since warmed up to the rest of these. And this would have come around by about the late 90s for me. I really got into this album. And it was also part of that time when Elegantly Wasted came out and I wanted more, so I went back giving this one here a fresh listen and found that again, I think what it is in time where I had listened to a lot more alternative rock and different sounding things by that point, this album didn't sound so out of the ordinary. Maybe different than INXS, but not out of the ordinary in terms of musical styles that I was listening to. So I was finally able to accept it. Next one, Journey, Eclipse from 2011, 14th studio album, second to feature vocalist Arnel Pineda. It was an attempt by guitarist Neil Schon to make a more hard rock sounding album, but I just felt like the songs fell flat at the time. They weren't very memorable, nothing really stuck with me, and I wasn't impressed overall by the production. And I have to say the production on it still sort of leaves a lot to be desired, but a good near 10 years went by, and this is only from a couple of years ago that I pulled the album out and found that I actually enjoyed all of the songs on here. Maybe I'd lived with them for a long enough time, I don't know. But I tried and tried and tried at the time to like this album. I'm a huge Journey fan, and I just couldn't get into it. It just didn't stick with me. But in time, I popped it on and was so happy that I'd kept it because I found that I really, really enjoyed this album after all. Okay, next one up, Judas Priest, Nostradamus, 2008, 16th studio album, double album at the time. But instead of it being two full albums of all, song-based songs that you'd expect, 9 or 10 of these are actually what I would call interludes. So you really get one album worth of songs and one album worth of interludes where they're all mixed within here. And I remember when I put this on, one, I felt cheated, and two, those interludes really kind of broke the flow of this album. It was had a very heavy sort of sound to it, and then you'd get these interludes, and I just didn't understand why that was. And it took a good year, maybe 2 years on it, where eventually I started to really enjoy that. What I first did was actually create a playlist digitally, and I removed all the interlude things, and I just listened to the tracks to where I really, really began to enjoy the 10 or 12 songs on here. And at that point, I went back and listened to the album and found that with all the interludes and everything, I found that I really enjoyed it after the fact. All right, the last one we're going to talk about as part of episode 1 here, Metallica, Saint Anger, 2003, 8th studio album. And this album here has made a lot of my worst albums by the biggest bands lists and things like that. And despite me putting it on those lists, that doesn't mean that I don't like these albums. So even when I do that, there's a lot of times that I actually enjoy these albums, which is why I wanted to make this episode here today, showing you that a lot of these albums that people slag, I've ended up growing, or they've grown on me over time, and this being one of them. And so this was made during a very tumultuous period of the band. It was caught on camera during the some kind of monster documentary. They were minus a bass player, and we got Bob Rock on. It's kind of interesting that 3 of the albums that I just did on here all were Bob Rock. So, or I think 3 across the whole list. I've covered definitely 2 of them here. So, whether he is a proponent to albums that I don't initially like and later love, or what that means, who knows. But, yeah, just was an album that with that strange drum sound, no guitar solos. The songs I felt were too long. They needed to be edited down, just all of that. But it was one of those albums too that I really wanted to understand. So I went back for probably a solid year, 2 years, throwing it on every so often and giving it a listen, trying to really understand what they were doing. And in time, I found that basically after the first 3 songs, from track 4 to the end, I really like those tunes. There's some really great songs on here. And again, I think with a remix and guitar solos added, they just would have been over the top. But doesn't mean I don't like the album. It's still a really good album. It's just not a traditional sounding Metallica album. And threw me off at the beginning, but I did warm up to it in the end. And so there you go. Hopefully you enjoyed this part 1 episode where we ran through 10 albums I hated but grew to love. Do check back tomorrow for part 2 where I'm going to run through 10 more such albums. All right, everyone. Take care. Have a good one. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.